Hello, and welcome to Spokane County Spotlight. I'm Commissioner Josh Kerns, and my guests today are Washington State Senator Andy Billig from the 3rd Legislative District and State Representative Matt Shea from the 4th Legislative District. Gentlemen, welcome to our program today. Before we get started, I'd like to give the audience a little bit of an overview of the districts you each represent. So Senator Billig, if you could start off by giving us a little overview of the boundary of your district and what some of the most important issues are to the people of the district you represent.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Commissioner, for inviting me on today. Glad to be here. Yeah, the 3rd Legislative District, there are 49 legislative districts, and I represent the 3rd District, which is the heart of the city of Spokane, about mid-South Hill, down the hill through downtown, and then up to about Francis on the north side. And it's a very much an urban district. Probably the two biggest issues are poverty. Out of 49 legislative districts, we're 49th in median household income. And so issues related to breaking the cycle of poverty, so education, particularly early learning, are important in that area. Also, always important is protecting the Spokane River, and because the aquifer that our drinking water comes from interacts with the river, it's not only protecting it for aesthetic purposes and for economic purposes, but also for our drinking water, which is really such a core issue for everybody in the inland Northwest and throughout the state.
Okay. Representative Shea, could you give us an idea of the boundaries of the 4th Legislative District and what some of the top issues are on your constituents' minds?
Well, absolutely. And first, I start off with the 4th District is very conservative, and we really hold the values of freedom and liberty core. And so I would say those values are really kind of boundless. But as far as boundaries for legislative district, we actually go to the Idaho border, all the way south to the mountain range, and then up north to Green Bluff, and then right to about Costco, which everybody knows. You kind of draw a north-south line there. And we're very concerned in the 4th District about our jobs and also our businesses going across the border to Idaho. It's one of the biggest issues we have because in some respects, Idaho is a friendlier business climate, and I'm sure we'll get to a little bit of those topics later. But I also want to mention agriculture. It's huge to the 4th District. We have Green Bluff, one of the great places to visit in Spokane County, and so we continue to move forward on those issues and really keep a spotlight on them, because I think that rural Washington does not get represented sometimes in Olympia. And thank you also for having us on today. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. We're glad to have both of you with us today. Senator Billig, could you give our audience sort of a history of your background and what it was that led you to seek office?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's an important question that doesn't always get asked. Well, I'm a dad. That was one factor. I've spent most of my adult life running the Spokane Indians baseball team. I was the president and general manager, and now still involved as a co-owner and an executive with the team. And I love that job. I got to run a professional baseball team. It was just a dream job. But after doing it for 18, 19 years, I was ready for something additional. I wanted to do something more in terms of public service, and an opportunity to run for office came up, and I jumped at it. And by jumping at it, I mean I spent a year researching it and kind of building a base, and then decided to move forward with running for the state House. I never run for anything before, other than in 5th grade I ran to be the class representative in the student body in my elementary school, and I lost that election. So the first election I won was in 2010 when I ran for the House, and then 2 years later ran for the Senate when Lisa Brown retired as the 3rd District State Senator, and have served in the Senate since then.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Representative Shea, could you give us a description of your background and what it was that propelled you to seek office?
Sure. 4 generations of my family are from Eastern Washington. We homesteaded down near Dayton, Washington, in the Palouse, and just a long history of agriculture and logging in my family. And I came back from serving 10 years in the United States Army, came back from Iraq, and didn't want to be one of those people that was sitting on the couch complaining all the time about what was on the TV, but actually wanted to get out and do something. I think there's some similarities actually when you run for office. It's not a quick decision, or at least it shouldn't be a quick decision. And so it was about a month of prayer and fasting for me to come to that decision to seek office. And I had not run for anything before either. but I did run for student body president in 4th grade, and I actually did win that one, barely. So.
All right. Now, with the 2017 session just wrapping up not that long ago, but Representative Shea, could you start off by telling us some of what you view as the highlights of the 2017 legislative session?
Sure. Contrary to some of the things that have been kind of more in the mainstream media, there was a lot of bipartisan work that went on, and that was really encouraging. I'll highlight a few. One of them was on veterans issues. We worked together, both sides of the aisle, to really put some more protections in for our veterans, and particularly pro bono services through the Attorney General of Washington State. And I thought that was just a huge thing. Obviously, that's something near and dear to my heart, and I think something the veterans need. We also, I think, had kind of an interesting thing happen with religious liberty, where we had a lot of bipartisan agreement. Senator Palumbo, who really worked very well with me on protecting and defending religious liberty. It's kind of one of the first times we've ever been able to really do that across party lines. And then third, we had boycott, divestment, and sanctions House Joint Memorial that we had introduced. A lot of broad bipartisan support of Israel as part of that joint memorial, and I thought that was really good. And then lastly, one of the great highlights for me anyway of the session was I was elected as caucus chair for the House Republicans, which is a lot more time spent in Olympia, but it was very fulfilling to be in a leadership position this time around.
All right. Senator Billig, any highlights that stick out to you?
Yeah, well, it was a momentous session in many ways. I spent probably the bulk of my time working on the K-12 education funding and spending plan, which known as the McCleary Plan. And I was one of 8 legislators that was negotiating that throughout session and throughout the special session. It was both frustrating and then ultimately rewarding when we came up with a plan that invested $7.3 billion into education, into the lives of young people in Washington State, and really into the economic and democratic future of our state, because we know that education makes a difference. We know we have a problem with an opportunity gap, and this plan that we put into place in a bipartisan way is going to make a difference and help every child to achieve their fullest potential. And I really appreciate what Representative Shea said. So the partisanship is what gets the news coverage. So that's what people hear about. But this McCleary Plan was an example of 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans working together, with all trying to get to yes, and we came up with a plan that passed with a huge majority, and I think is going to really make a difference for kids in Washington.
Yeah, you rarely hear about the 98-0 votes and the 49-0 votes.
Yes.
Senator Billig, could you tell us what committees do you serve on in Olympia? And then could you also touch on the leadership position that you have in your caucus?
Yeah, great. So I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, which in the Senate is the budget, both the operating budget and the capital budget committee. I also serve on the K-12 Education Committee, which also does early learning in the Senate, and I'm the early learning lead for our caucus, so I've been very involved in those issues. And then I also serve as the Deputy Minority Leader. And so in that role, you really work on all issues, and also sort of the strategy and helping other members to be successful, and really helping the whole Senate and the whole legislature to be successful. I've had that role for a couple years and found it very rewarding. And in fact, we were just talking about how Spokane is so well represented in leadership positions, which really means that Spokane is going to do well. And we talk about sometimes of how we're all together in our party, the Spokane party, and trying to be really advocating together as a delegation for Spokane.
All right, wonderful. Representative Shea, you touched on being in a leadership role in your last question. So could you tell us a little more about that, but then also the committees that you serve on?
Absolutely. So the caucus chair runs the meetings essentially in preparation for going onto the floor, and there's also some other responsibilities. When I was originally starting the session, I was the ranking Republican on environment, but when the caucus chair position came up and came through, I had to give that position up, and I'm still on transportation and judiciary, which are 2 very important issues to this region, particularly on transportation with the North-South Freeway project. So it's been an honor to be able to serve in that capacity, but also, again, I think it helps represent the region a lot better when we have that many people in leadership positions.
Okay. any particular bills either of you introduced this year that were meaningful to you that you or that you actually that were passed into law this year? Senator Billig?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I work a lot on education, so spent a lot of time on the McCleary bill and the McCleary plan, but also worked quite a bit on early learning and passed a bill that allows local municipalities and local school districts to invest in early learning in a way that's a lot more efficient. So if a local community wants to do an early learning program, there's no real way to do that efficiently. So if you're as big as Seattle, you can just create your own program. But if you're a smaller city or a school district, you don't want to take on all those expenses and time and energy of creating a whole system. So this bill would allow local municipalities and school districts to invest in the state program and expand the state program of early learning within their boundaries, and either in terms of eligibility or more slots. So that was one. And then the other thing that I work on a lot is campaign finance transparency. I really think that it's important that we know who is behind the money in our election system. And the courts have been clear that limits are not something that are going to be tolerated to any great degree. And so if that's not going to happen, then let's at least have great transparency so we know who's spending money where. And that's good for our democracy and something that really is a bipartisan issue as well.
Okay. Representative Shea, any particular bills of note that you were the prime sponsor of, or that you got passed this legislative session?
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I'll dovetail on the transparency part. I mean, that's one place where there's a lot of agreement across party lines. House Bill 1010 would allow the Department of Ecology to put online all of their interagency agreements. And to give you an idea of the scope and size of those, about 4,000 interagency agreements, all which have either a fiscal or policy or both impact. And this just allows citizens to take a look at what those agreements are, and also local governments to take a look at what some of these agreements are and see if there's any room for efficiency and improvement. Also was able to pass House Bill 2064. Very proud of that. The first time in 80 years, industrial hemp has been legalized officially in Washington State. That has been a huge boon to farmers, especially near Moses Lake, which grew the first in 80 years. Industrial hemp, for a lot of people that don't know about industrial hemp, it can be used in all kinds of different aspects. You can use it for textiles and clothing. You can use it for fiber for car doors. You can use it in medicine. You can use it also in food supplements, and also supplements for agriculture as far as cattle is concerned. So just a lot of different things that industrial hemp could be used for. And Washington State used to be one of the largest exporters of hemp in the entire world, and I hope we return to that very soon. I would like to add one last thing, and I think this is important anytime that we talk about local government and decentralizing control. One of the things that gets kind of missed is like search and rescue operations and some of the law enforcement aspects. And had a bill this year that was actually, the Senate version was passed, that would give some immunity to folks that are part of our search and rescue teams. And I think it's important, especially in Eastern Washington, an issue that maybe gets overlooked.
Okay. So we've heard a lot of stories in the media. We see the stuff on Facebook from two people who were actually there. What were some of the biggest challenges for the legislative session?
Well, I think education funding certainly was, because we're under a court order. It's taken 4 years to really put the pressure on the legislature to come up with this plan, and a lot of times the really tough work gets done when there's a hard deadline, and so that was certainly a challenge. I think we'll probably talk about the Hearst water bill was a challenge. Passing the capital budget has been a challenge. I'll leave that for a little bit later. It gets missed that most of the bills pass unanimously or near unanimously, and so we're really working together collaboratively to work through those challenges. And there's one bill that I wanted to mention that we took the Department of Early Learning and turned it into took some pieces out of the Children's Administration, Department of Health and Human Services, or DSHS, and created a new agency called the Department of Family, Youth, and Children. And that is an agency that's going to be focused on prevention, so that instead of just addressing foster care and making sure foster care is good, we're going to actually prevent kids from getting into foster care. And that's going to be the primary focus of this agency that was created. And I think that was a challenge to get that passed, but I think a real success. And I think we're going to save money and help kids to change the trajectory of their lives with that agency.
Okay, all right. Representative Shea in the House, any specific issues that stick out in your mind as being challenges for the session?
Clearly budget and education. I mean, there's just no question about that. And particularly education reforms. I mean, that was something I think that got lost in the conversation on, how do we fund this and everything. There were some great things that came out of that collaborative effort, being able to actually have some geographic modifiers for the teacher pay and have a more uniform teacher pay across the state of Washington, I thought was great. But it was a challenge to get there and literally took almost a year of discussions. And what got lost, I think, in the media was that prior to session, there were discussions that had already been occurring all summer into the winter and then, coming into the session. One of the other issues too was on graduation requirements and the biology assessment and all of that, and how do we go about doing it. And I think, again, there was great collaboration to come to hey, we need to continue to delay this. We shouldn't have kids that are not graduating just because of one requirement like that. The real challenging aspect of the budget, though, I think continues to be, do we increase spending, and then how do we pay for it if we're going to increase spending? And I think that there's probably disagreement there between us on that, because increasing spending by 30%, and now we're $57 million in the hole as of today with the recent forecast. I think those are the things that we're going to have to grapple with. And honestly, I think what we need to do is look at how we make hard choices about reforming and making government more efficient, and the bureaucrats in government more efficient in providing services. And I think if we continue the collaboration, we can get to some really good successes that have long-term impact and solution for the positive for the citizens of Washington State.
Can I just add on to that?
Absolutely.
I think Representative Shea hit it right on. I mean, revenue is clearly, and spending is really where we have the most conflict. And some of that conflict's okay because was designed by the framers of our state and our country to have a little bit of that tension, and you get good ideas in the middle out of that. But it is where the tension is, and I think from my perspective, when the challenge is, as we do just what Representative Shea was talking about, is really find out a way to make our tax system more fair. Out of all 50 states in the country, we have the most regressive, the least fair tax system. And as we make changes, and I think we should make changes, we need to make sure we're doing it in a way that people are paying their fair share.
All right. So one of the issues that was touched on a little earlier was the Hearst decision, and now that's something that myself and the other commissioners have definitely had an eye on, seeing as trying to see what happened in the legislative session in regards to that Supreme Court ruling. But Representative Shea, if we could start with you, could you give a little background on the Hearst decision and kind of what we saw in the 2017 session on how that was addressed?
Sure, and I'll try to give the objective approach to the background, but most legal scholars and those that have been involved in water law understood the Supreme Court's decision in Hearst to overturn about 150 years of Western water law. And the reason that I say that is because previous to that, there had been a presumption that if you were using 5,000 gallons a day or less, that was not impairing any water right, whether surface or ground, surrounding your property. And the Hearst decision really touched on two things. One was water quality, and the other was water quantity. And really, for the purposes of where there was quite a sticking point and challenge, was water quantity, how much water is there. There's a difference between surface water and groundwater. That was also part of the Hearst decision, and something called in-stream flows, which is essentially a water right given to a river, really made for the Hearst decision to become a challenge to those in Eastern Washington, because essentially now that there is a presumption that every time that you put a well in, that you cannot presume anymore that there's no impairment. You actually have to presume that there is an impairment and prove a negative or show that you're not impairing those water rights around you, whether they're ground or surface. Now, effectively, the science has shown that groundwater does not typically affect the surface water except in a few regions in Washington state. And as we continue to talk about Hearst, it brought us closer together that those regions that had already been identified, that the plans for management and mitigation in those regions were already working well. Maybe we should just leave those alone and return to that presumption that we had before Hearst, that there was no impairment if you drilled a well.
Okay. Senator Billig?
Well, this has certainly been a hot topic and one that we've spent a lot of time working on. And it's anytime you talk about water, it's contentious and it's complex. And even just hearing that summary, it's complicated. There's a lot of pieces to it. And those issues often take a while to reach that agreement. We have a split legislature, and it often takes quite a while. We talked about the K-12 funding plan that took really 4 years to come up with a resolution. And so one of the things, so I want to find a solution. I think is really important. I really appreciate what Spokane County has done to take the lead on a water banking plan, which is one of the ways that you can address this, but certainly not the full solution that we need. And also we heard from these families who had bought this land and they're waiting to build their dream house or just their house, and they're held up. So I really wanted to find out, when it was clear we weren't going to get an agreement for a long-term plan, is to at least find a temporary plan. And one of the proposals that was out there that I supported is say, let's just put everything on hold for 24 months, go back to before the court decision, and basically go to how it was before, and say we're going to let all those families we heard from, we're going to let them all build, we're going to let builders to get permits, and then keep working on a permanent solution. I was disappointed that didn't happen, and especially disappointed that the capital budget, basically the Senate Republicans said, we're not going to pass a capital budget, which is a huge jobs bill, really important to the Spokane region, unless we get a permanent Hearst solution, which was kind of stalemated. That was very disappointing that we lost the capital budget based on that. I'm hoping at some point soon we can rectify that, but that's where we are right now.
And truly it is, whiskey is for drinking, water's for fighting. That's the old adage, and really is coming true here in the western United States, but particularly in eastern Washington. And one of the leverage of holding the capital budget bond vote specifically to get a permanent water fix, I think was a strategy that I supported for a couple reasons. Water, it seems, has not been dealt with in a very direct manner over the last several years, and I think that the blame lays in both parties for that. But what I would say is that you cannot really have long-term revenue solutions until we get this water issue fixed, because property values decreasing, especially in rural Washington, is going to have a dramatic impact on the taxes that are going to fund education. And that's one of the biggest reasons I thought we had to have a solution up front. And I'm glad that despite the stalemate, that the conversations are continuing.
Okay. If we could bring it back more locally to Spokane, specifically the 3rd District and the 4th District, what were some of the big victories of this session that you think are going to have the biggest impacts on your constituents? Representative Shea?
There are several. I think again we touched on one of those, and that's kind of the teacher pay issue. I think that's been a huge issue, particularly because we have Idaho right next door, and there's competition and people that are literally moving to a state based on teacher pay. I think that was one great solution. I think some of the other reforms that occurred out of that were also good solutions. I would bring up one thing that didn't make a lot of splash, and that is, it looks like we're very close to reaching agreement on the black tank issue. And that wasn't necessarily legislation in Olympia, but more the local delegation working together with both Burlington Northern, Department of Ecology, and Department of Transportation to find a true solution that both cleans up the environment, but also allows that project to continue south, which is going to be huge for economic development in Spokane County.
Okay. Senator Billig?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of accomplishments, we've already talked about a bunch of them with education and early learning. One we haven't mentioned is the paid family leave policy, which won't go into effect for a few years, but this is something that's going to make a difference. Most industrialized countries have paid family leave. If you have a baby, you can take time off to spend time with that baby. There's a lot of science to show that the outcomes for that baby long-term are better, and also obviously it's a good family benefit to offer. And so we're going to have a family leave policy in Washington State that is substantial and I think fair for employers. As an employer myself, it was one I watch very closely, but also as somebody who really tries to look out for working families. I thought it struck just the right balance, and I was glad to see that. I think the capital budget, when it does pass, and hopefully it will pass, has a lot of important wins for Spokane, including a science building for Eastern Washington University, money for the Family Justice Center at the YWCA that helps to prevent domestic violence, and quite a number of other projects that are going to be important for jobs and for quality of life in Spokane.
Okay. The capital budget also, from the 4th District's perspective, that was one of the most well-negotiated documents that came out of the session. We have, the CHAS clinic that would get some money for continued construction out there, the Appleway Trail as well, and I think those are very important things for the community, in addition to the Hub Sports Center, which even if you live in Spokane, some people live in Idaho, they're coming to the Hub Sports Center, and it's become really something that's very important to the community.
Yeah, and dental access for low-income folks is one of the priorities out of that budget, not only in the Valley, but also downtown and across the state, and was glad to see that included in the budget, which we'll hopefully get to soon.
Okay. And we are getting low on time, but so if we keep our next answer short on this one, so after all this we've discussed, what do you see happening in the 2018 legislative session? Senator Billig?
Well, capital budget, hopefully we'll get to, if not in 2018 or before. We're going to need some tweaks on the education bill. I was frustrated with the process that we came out with the education policy bill so late, and there wasn't a lot of time for feedback from school districts and parents and students and teachers, and so we're going to probably end up making a few tweaks, although I've been surprised that there hasn't, at how well received it has been. I think we absolutely need to focus on campaign finance transparency and voter access. I think one thing, Representative Shea talks about freedom a lot, and I agree. We need to have a focus on freedom. I think freedom to vote when you're an eligible voter is really important, and we got to make sure that that freedom exists for everybody.
Okay. Representative Shea?
I think we're going to be revisiting religious liberty again, because that did die in the Senate. I think that we will be taking a look at that again. It's become very important to a lot of people, regardless of religious affiliation, that those things that are enshrined in the state constitution, Article 1, Section 11, specifically in Article 26, are actually implemented at the local level. Lastly, I would say I think we're going to be tackling what I call equalization of taxes for our manufacturers. We talk a lot about jobs. These are not just jobs, these are careers, and I disagreed with the governor vetoing that incentive and that equalization, because I think if it's good enough for Boeing, and a lot of the proponents said it was, and good for jobs, it should be equal across the board for all manufacturers.
All right. I'd like to thank my guests, Senator Andy Billig and Representative Matt Shea, for joining me here today. I'm County Commissioner Josh Kerns. Thank you for joining us on Spokane County Spotlight.